Alright guys, so today we're going to be going over Dale Tuggy's critique of relative identity. Now, this critique is found in his book, Monotheism, Heresy, and the Bible, Essays on Biblical Unitarianism. And I'm going over this specific critique because the paper that I'm going to release for you guys soon is directly attacking foundations of which allows critiques like Dale Tuggy's to exist in the first place. So it's a bit of a refresher so that you guys can understand relative identity and the kind of critiques that my paper will be addressing. So in reference to relative identity, Dale Tuggy states, "But a majority of recent philosophers have thought that this proliferation of sameness relations is unnecessary and wrong-headed. This is because it seems that we can analyze any statement of the form A is the same K as B as a conjunction of three assertions. A is a K, B is a K, and A equals B." So what Dale Tuggy is trying to do here is he's trying to say statements that say X is the same K as Y, or if you want to fill in the variables, you can say Superman is the same man as Clark Kent, just reduced to saying that Superman is a man, right? Superman is a K. Clark Kent is a man, Clark Kent is a K, and Superman is absolutely identical to Clark Kent, right? So he's trying to reduce the relative identity statement into an absolute identity statement. So now, is this a successful reduction or analysis? Well, first we have to look at what the main requirement for a successful reduction is of one of these theories. And that is a successful reduction must preserve the content of what it reduces. And what that means is that the reduced formulation must retain the original theories defining truth conditions and distinctions in a different theory or vocabulary. For relative identity, right, the key defining characteristic is the possibility of A being the same G as B, while A being a distinct P, right? And if Dale Tuggy translates A is the same G as B as just A equals B, then his analysis here excludes the possibility of representing A being a distinct P than B, right? Which would therefore not preserve the content of relative identity, so it is not a successful reduction, rather it's an elimination of relative identity. Being said here, I know that was a little bit complicated, especially looking at that on the screen. So basically, think about it this way. Imagine I said, can you reduce what a bachelor is, right? You might say, well, yeah, I can say what a bachelor is by using a conjunction of a man and somebody who is married, right? So you take those two together and it forms the bachelor. So the bachelor can be reduced to more fundamental aspects of itself, right? So in that sense, it's a reduction. But if I got rid of one of the key aspects of what makes a bachelor, then it would not be a reduction, it would be an elimination or some redefinition, right? For example, if I got rid of married and I just had man, and I just said, you know, a bachelor is a man is a bachelor, same thing, then I wouldn't be reducing it, right? It wouldn't be a reduction of it. It wouldn't be breaking it down into simpler parts or forms. It would just be eliminating the concept entirely. Similarly, when Dale Tuggy talks about relative identity, he says, well, we can look at this through the analysis of absolute identity, so there's no need for relative identity. But what he acts like he's doing is he's acting as if he's taking what relative identity can do, what makes it itself, and showing that absolute identity can do that. But he's not doing that, right? Because he's eliminating the possibility, which is a defining characteristic of relative identity, of the ability to be the same in one respect to a sortal and the ability to be different in another respect to the sortal. Now, in the book, Dale Tuggy tries to do what he calls conceptual analysis of a certain example, which is in Genesis. Abraham is identified as the same person as Abram, right? There's just different names for the same person. And he says it would be right to say that Abraham is a man, Abram is a man, he's the same man as Abraham, and that Abraham is absolutely identical to Abram. Now, we can just completely grant this. Let's just say there are cases where there are absolute identity examples, whatnot, but you cannot infer from that therefore absolute identity exhausts all identity relations. That's the very inference that he needs to justify, right? You can't just go from, here's one example of absolute identity to therefore absolute identity exhausts all identity relations. That's the very thing in question. So what's being challenged here is not that absolute identity exists, because as a lot of you know, there's relative identity theorists who accept absolute identity as a part of logical language. The disputed inference is that if you have the sameness of some sortal, that implies sameness of absolute identity. That's what's being disputed, right? That is a claim that any sort of sortal relation that you put, between A and B, that always implies that A and B are absolutely identical. So they're grounded in, whatever you want to call it, in absolute identity. So absolute identity exhausts all logical identity. So we've arrived at the part where I take most issue with. This is 8.4.1. And the reason I take issue with this is because I feel like it's blurring the lines between these different categories, and it's very convenient that this is happening in this chapter. At the beginning of this chapter, it reads, deductive logic has to do with the meanings of sentences and with what implies what. Whether or not a deductive argument is valid is wholly a matter of its structure. The subject matter of an argument is not relevant to whether or not it has the right kind of structure, right? The chapter of this section is called Logic is Subject Neutral. Now, this is kind of misleading because logic taken as a whole is not completely subject neutral, right? Predicates, relations, functions, all those types of things are considered a part of logic, but they're not subject neutral. That's why at the beginning of the paragraph, he clarifies deductive logic is subject neutral. And what he's trying to say that is these inference rules, governing premise to premise, that is subject neutral. That we agree with, right? But logic taking as a whole is not completely subject neutral, and you guys will see why that's relevant. So the reason it's relevant here is because this comes immediately after a chapter and immediately after the words which are describing what seems like some logical principles of some kind. And it goes with his entire 16 principles here, specifically the last 3 of them. As you'll see here, Principle 14 states, if the same thing of some kind, then same thing. Being the same thing of some sort implies being numerically the same, identical. If A and B are the same F, then A equals B. Principle 15 says if different things of a kind, then different things, kind of just the inverse. And Principle 16 says identity is not kind relative. It's impossible to be the same F, thing of a certain kind, while being different G's, numerically distinct things of some other kind. Now, this is relevant because if you put a section immediately after this, literally immediately after these words, the person, especially if they're not familiar with logic, is going to obviously think that what you're talking about being subject neutral here is what you just put as A equals B or same K or something of that sort. And as you'll see here, that principle that he's trying to say, which is basically to say something like you have the same K in a relation between A and B, let's say a binary predicate, or they have the same K, same sortal, that implies A is identical to B or absolute identity. That is not a principle of logic, right? And that's what he's trying to imply here, that invariance, invariant to interpretation, invariance to subject matter, you just have these sort of rules of inference governing everything, and it doesn't matter about the subject matter, but that's just a mix of categories there, and you'll see why. Now, let me give you an example that I think I've shown on this channel quite a couple times, which is the traditional LPT people try to run, where they say the first premise is for all x and for all y, if x is God and y is God, then x equals y. Then you affirm the antecedent, right? Jesus is God, the Father is God, and then you get the consequence, which is Jesus is the Father. Now, given the rules of deduction, right, if then modus ponens, it follows, given the antecedent is true, right, given, whether you accept the whole conditional or not. So you have to accept the premises, but deduction doesn't give you the premises, right? Deduction itself does not give you the premises. Similarly, if he wants to say something like same K implies A equals B, same K, therefore A equals B, you can use deduction to form an argument in which, you create that conditional, and then assuming you accept the first premise or the second premise, then the consequent follows. But deduction or, subject neutrality itself does not give you that same K or same sortal means absolute identity. Deduction is going to give you the bridge between the already assumed connection, right, between the antecedent and its consequent, right? So assuming the antecedent, then you get the consequent. But deduction itself does not give you the antecedent or the consequent in terms of what the antecedent is or what the consequent is. In this case, it's same sortal, and then the consequent would be A equals B. So he's blurring the line here, and it's not explicit here in terms of what he's saying, but my point here is that if you put, your principles right before the section in which you're talking about, logic being invariant or, subject neutral, then of course the people, when they see you talking about A equals B, same K, K is an A is a K, B is a K, they're going to think that you're talking about that subject neutrality, right? But that is not the case here. What he's proposing here is a semantic theory. He's not just telling us a law of logic that if, you have the same sortal, then A equals B. That's not a theorem of logic. That's not a law of logic, right? And so I think it's just super important to clarify that, because that's what the book makes it seem like. It makes it seem like he's not proposing anything super controversial here. Rather, he's just telling us what logic is and what logic does, and it doesn't matter if you're a theist or an atheist. And in the book, he says, I would still hold to this, if he wasn't a Unitarian, right? So he's making it seem as if this is the invariance, but it's not. This is, again, a semantic theory. Not only that, it's the very thing in question, right? You can't just propose it and say, well, this reduces to absolute identity, and then talk about subject invariance, right? This is the very thing in question. Of course, the relative identity theorist is denying that sortals reduce to absolute identity. He has to provide an argument for that. Just giving us a conditional where you have a sortal in the antecedent, and in the consequent you have absolute identity, is not an argument, right? That's just you asserting that anytime you have a sortal, then it reduces to absolute identity. And so he actually has to provide an argument for that. And the closest thing we get from him in terms of that is he says there's some intuitive understanding that everyone has. I mean, if that was the whole argument, I don't think you would have a whole section in the book about relative identity, right? And what seems like what you're trying to do is refute it, or at least give people doubts upon its legitimacy in being in a logical language.